Composing Gloves here, and today we're going to be doing a breakdown of my track Bath Test. This is an old track. 7 years ago. I just checked. Yeah, at B Smith 8166. This video is mostly for you because you're very interested in knowing how the funky parts of this track work, how this all kind of gets down. So I figure we'll just go through it and I'll explain sort of some of my thought processes and especially some of the things I was doing at the time that I don't know, I wrote a lot of really weird, funky music, kind of like this, and had a good time with it. I was interested in these asymmetric kind of phrases and things that landed on the beat, but not right on the beat. But I wrote everything in with a mouse. Nothing is played in. Everything was typed in. And interestingly, there are no drum loops either. So starting off, it's just a fade in. I don't know. I'm just looking for some kind of an intro. Just have a pad. These are all Kontakt instances, by the way. If you're interested in the libraries I'm using this Scoring Guitars by Heaviosity, eDNA. This is Spitfire stuff, Spitfire Audio, probably part of Tundra. If I had to guess, it's where these pads are coming from. The bells are from the LA Drama Drums. Man, I love this percussion library. Probably my favorite percussion library. It's awesome. It sounds so good. Awesome library. And then the brass are horns and the bass trombones. That's the only brass. And so with that in mind, let's press on. So yeah, we open up with these pads. Yeah, so these are the hats I'm going after. They're coming in and I am just bringing up delay. So I let them ring out. So I actually only write the first little bit and then the delay carries the rest through. And then we have these like vocal stabs that come in on beat 3 that I just thought sounded kind of cool and I chopped it up and moved them around. Okay, so here comes up the first bit of phrasing. You could kind of see how this went because there's lead 2, lead 3, lead 4. Usually this is an indicator that I wrote one phrase and I wanted to keep the same phrase, the same content, but I wanted to change little things about it so that it felt familiar, that repetition legitimizes. And there were just little things so that it stayed interesting, but it felt familiar. And if you do that kind of a thing, you can often get away with much more complex ideas as things build, and it doesn't feel so overwhelming when you've reached those ideas. So this is our first idea. This synth is one that I just made. It's a pretty straightforward synth. It's got some distortion, some unison, reverb, and not a lot here. It's just a saw wave synth. They work fantastic for this kind of stuff because they're very simple sounds. So you can write more complex lines with them. Hitting A, there is a rhythmic phrase, and this is a common theme in this track. There'll be a rhythm, and it's mostly rhythm, and then there'll be some sort of response that has more movement, more melodic stuff going on. So here we've got this dun dun dun, and then we have this response bum 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 bum, and that's how it's going to work. And then on the fourth one, I do something different, right? I'm using the rule of 3. So you do something 3 times, fourth time, probably want to vary it up, and that tends to follow expectation. And if you follow expectation, that also gives you room to break expectation in other areas a little bit more. And you can sometimes get away with it. It's kind of a line you have to walk. And something that really helps a phrase sound funky is by not sticking to the beat. I hold Alt when I put notes down and change them by these small amounts. And with sounds like this that are gated, basically, so when they play and they stop, they just flat out stop. You can get these really cool, funky rhythms and introduce this sense of groove, even though for most of this, I'm landing right on the grid. We look at this. And I am largely thinking in A minor here, but mostly just like scale figures. So like A's, and then a phrase to bend back to an A, taking advantage of the leading tone here, doing that again, and having these short notes, again, provide that cool sense of rhythm. Bum, 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 bum. You know, that's a lot cooler than bum, 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 bum. I think it is. It's interesting as I've collaborated with people. Some people really don't like the shortness and they want the longer sustained stuff. Like I do that right here as a variation. And there is a bend on this. If you see there's a legato, but it really only matters in certain cases. Like you see some of these cases, the shortness of the notes just don't matter. These longer cases though, it matters a little more. So we're in version 2. And you can see I start to play with what I can get away with because you've already heard it once. And here I do some variations, but things are no longer landing like right on the beat. There are things that are off now that happen slightly before. And let's go to 3 and see what we're doing here. Another variation. And the drums come in. Okay, so these are the drums. There's actually not a whole lot going on here. We got a kick, a snare, a shaker, and a percussive element. What is this? This sound. A shaker, a snare. And these are all just like samples from I don't know where I grabbed them. If I go looking for them, this looks like from a Vengeance pack. Yeah, Vengeance House Essential or something. You know, I just go looking for interesting things. The way I look at samples now has changed a lot because sometimes I go through my file system. Other times I use a plugin like EXO or Atlas to browse the samples. Really changes. Yeah, so if we look at the drum bus, we start off with a Fruity Free filter. And I think some of these things you have to go turn on. They're old plugins that just don't exist anymore. Or they do exist, but they're off by default. So it's literally just a filter. And I chose to use this. I have no idea why. I just want it to be different. There is a comb filter on this thing. This is the Melda Audio comb filter. This thing is awesome. And that's what's coming in and offering that really weird texture. Yeah, that's the comb filter doing that job. And then finally, there is a bit of a dynamic EQ at the end. And that's all on the drum bus. So these 4 little sounds come in. And that's what comes through. We have a drum rise intro, and that's going to lead us into basically the first drop as we wrap up the last phrase of this. And I wanted something, you know, interesting. And by introducing the drums in this way, it makes the drop feel less sudden, and you can kind of get a vibe for the type of groove we're going to have already coming out of it. And the way they come in also is just really nice. I should state as well on the master, there is a gross beat with the momentary preset. And I am just automating this around. I have I think somewhere on here, it might only appear at certain sections. Like you can see the comb filter here. But there's a gross beat turning on and off that will offer glitches. And there's also an isotope stutter edit that is also doing glitchy things, sort of like a gross beat will. So let's go ahead and hear this. You hear that comb filter. So this is a pretty classic case of call and response. Ba ba da bump bump da. You know, That's like, our first phrase. I mean, you could even call just this voice, this da-na-na, this like filter wobble, the first one. And these wobbles are often set on either 1/3 beat grid lines or half beat. And then the concavity of these lines is a huge indicator to the rhythm. And I have a specific filter I like for this stuff. That's another one that you have to like turn on. If I click it, will it pull it up for me? It's right here. It's this fruity, fast, low pass. I have videos talking about why I like this one. It is an extremely sharp filter. And by what I mean by that is when you write a automation, man, it's gonna cut it off almost like a volume control right then and there. So I really like this one. And we get our second bass sound. So there is this Razor preset called Barnaby. I can't remember if I altered anything about it, but it just had that awesome attack. And I was like, oh yeah, I can work with this. I introduced it though as this wobble thing at first, completely removing the attack. And later on, we'll hear the attack and the craziness that it is later. But yeah, so we have this like first bit. And you can hear the drums kind of match this. And I do things with my kick that for this style is kind of important. I love doing this. You pitch the kick, you write it up and down. So you can see here this downward thing that sort of matches the phrase. The drums have to go with your phrase. It's almost an art getting them to line up. You got to pick what you're going to write first. And I'm pretty sure I wrote drums first, but I alter the drums as I get my phrase going. Yeah, do. That kind of a thing. That snare being in the same spot really helps us have freedom to mess with the drums. And then the shaker, I generally just have do like crazy stuff. I don't think too hard about it, other than I don't want the shaker in a regular pattern that emphasizes things in a normal kind of a way. I want it to be like off and different every time, a little asymmetric. Yeah, so these horns come in, dun-on, and they're just a response to what's going on over here. So we have sort of a bass response, a chord hit, fun sound, and then a push to the next phrase, bass response, or a bass question, no chord hit, and then a response. And then this is sort of the formula. You can see here's another chord hit as we go through for every 2 bars. And then the notes themselves largely stick to A. I'm messing around, going around to A. It just depends on what I'm trying to do. There's a lot of stuff around the leading tone or chromatically approaching A in some way. And that's just a big part of it. There's also this EQ being automated down here on this sound. That's this one. And this EQ looks like an abomination from a mixing perspective. But from a sound design perspective, this is what I wanted. And it just moves the low end around in this odd way, because this is really going to affect how the kick sits with it. And you hear this like, whoa, 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 just all over the place. This is completely lost on the phone. But over bigger systems, it becomes a little more apparent. We have elements like this, like sub hits. You know that if we solo this. That is like so big for providing a sense of push into the next measure. But again, on phones, you're not going to hear that. And some people will do things to make it more audible on phones. I chose not to do that. You either miss out on it and it just becomes a silence, or, you know, you get to hear the glorious movement of what's going on there. Yeah, we've got our chimes. And we begin to bring in these chopping effects. That now these sit on the master, and we looked at those before. Gross beat, which is what this one is, and we may occasionally see the other one, stutter edit, come into play. Stutter edit, you can see MIDI stutter, these guys. Stutter edit requires MIDI triggers to operate, but it does a similar kind of crazy thing. So before, this is actually a lot of the same stuff that's over here. There's small differences, but on these fills, now we're getting this stutter edit, and this really consistent ride cymbal comes in, which helps you as things get more complicated, maintain a sense of where things sit. You still feel orientated, even though it's getting a little more wild. So if you're going to add some more chaos, you need to balance it out a little bit. And that tends to work out. So here's the stutter edit though. These basically act as fills now, different notes triggering different edits. And then, yeah, we have a rise in, a reverse thing there. When I wrote this, they didn't have the ability to do that. It's kind of crazy to me. But you can hear stutter edit also brings in like effects and things. It's a pretty cool plugin. It's really old. I'm pretty sure it's abandoned. Like they still sell it, but you know, do they still update it? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Another sub hit into it, to help us get over to this next section, which features a lot of the wobbles. And we get introduced to our response voice, which is just this low square thing. Again, picking a simple wave, because with simple waves, you can get harmonically and rhythmically a lot crazier with such a wave. And that guy is down here. This is lead 5. And it's the same lead as the intro, actually, just written a little bit differently, if I am not mistaken. Yeah, they're the same lead. So we're brought back to our lead, and now the two voices get to interact in just sort of this call and response way, and they have a conversation. And this conversation, you know, gets more interesting as you go, as you get familiar with the voices. So I use the first few bars here to sort of introduce them, and then some interesting back and forth can begin to happen. Yeah, and I take this opportunity to just do crazy stuff with the drums. The kick's going up and down. There's the comb filter is coming in and out, and they're almost as involved in this conversation as the two lead parts are. At times they're rhythmic, and at other times they're totally in the conversation. And I just love that back and forth. Whenever there's a gap that one can come in, you know, it kind of works out. You generally don't want all of them going at the same time. It gets a little too busy, but that can be really interesting. And we are largely sitting around really steady notes. I'm not like changing chords rapidly here. We're sitting around a ton of the time. And see, you can hear the drums almost have their own pitched phrase, and it's phrased like you would phrase an actual phrase. You know, it's not like just random glitches. They come in and they have almost a cadence at cadence points. And that really helps the effect sound musical. You come in. Like a resolution almost. Okay, so let's talk about this, because I actually really like how this came out. We are finally getting the fullness of that one sound. So that one sound's been here a lot of the time, but you kind of don't get it because it's hidden in these wobbles. And now you're hearing this cool, like, initial hit of the sound. The drums back off. They no longer have that craziness because I'm about to increase what I'm doing here. And if I'm going to make this crazier, I need to back something off. So I choose to back the drums off, just have it play sort of your standard drum roll. You can see the pattern doesn't even vary that much. There's a second pattern that comes in here, but it's mostly the same thing because this is just supposed to be in the forefront. And it's okay to have repetition that's a lot more repetitive if you have a really complicated thing going on. So this has a call and response within itself, but there's also these responses from the second synth line. So we have like our long note, and it sort of is question and answer, but it sort of answers itself. So we have these longer notes, and whenever the longer notes happen, the shorter notes come up in the other line. So it's sort of like responding to it, but it also responds to itself with these notes. If we take a look here, you can kind of see how it sort of works. And there's also these two ranges. Like we have a low range, right? And so we have this high range, this low question, high response, low question, high response, low question, high response. And then this guy is just going to respond to that. And I am using similar techniques as before with the taking the notes and lengthening and shortening them by various amounts to really get that cool sort of groovy effect on it. But a lot of it actually does sit directly on the grid. There's a few moments like this one that are maybe halfway points on the grid. I may have been working in a smaller grid setting, or I may have just held Alt and moved it by ear. But yeah, that's largely the conversation. And they sit, I don't think about scales too much in terms of the chords. I think about scales in terms of, you know, it's a phrase that sits around A, and I'm going to resolve to A. There's not like a major change in chord progression here. And that allows the rhythm and things like that to be a little crazier. Okay, so here we bring in a second layer. There's this bass 2 layer. And that's going to be playing against this Harmor 4, which is like a much more pure square wave along with the legato setting turned on. So it does have that gliding as we go through notes. So really detached notes and notes that overlap are going to be really, really different rhythmically, right? And so like if we listen to just this phrase here, that sort of a thing is accomplished by, and I'm just going from A to A. I don't think there's any notes in here. Yeah, all the notes are A minor. It's all just A minor. I'm staying to A minor. And these notes are very separate. And the big jump is really nice. They're all very separate. But then we have this overlap, and the legato will bend up to that note. And it just sounds nice. Going up and down by a range of about, if you had to give yourself around 2 octaves, and you have a sound that works well in 2 octaves, you know, these sorts of lines jumping up and down by octaves can be a really sort of interesting thing to do. Yeah, doom, doom, doom. You can hear it coming down. And then it responds to that. So and there's this triplet off feel here. Things are not lining up directly on them. Be like, look at that. Look at this tiny space. These sorts of things are what give you, can sometimes be a really big indicator of groove. Like they're not right on the grid. And the drums reinforcing the backbone sort of contrasts that delay. And it could just sound interesting. Yeah, and this they look like they're playing off, but it's just offset by an octave. But they're playing the same note. There's not like a harmony there. It's just together they're an interesting sound. And then we solo up that bass sound with a phrase and then a moment of silence, and then a run up to another phrase. And it's just a fun call and response thing again. Same drum intro. Bring in the layers. And you can hear hear the drums, now that this is a more simple idea, I go a little bit crazier and we can see some comb filter automation that again controls the drums are almost part of the conversation again in terms of like having a pitched role to play. Yeah. Fun fill there. And now the second drop has a lot of the same ideas, but now that second line comes in and we use that a little bit more. So that's, yeah, what's going on. Some pitch moves. Yeah, and then the hats trail off. We never really see these pads again, now I think about it, but it is a callback to sort of what this is doing at the intro of the track. Yeah, one thing I probably should have mentioned early on, but it's kind of obvious, is I have my swing setting up, and that's what causes the hats. Yeah, to do what they're doing. So, anyways, hopefully this answers some questions you had. If you have any other questions, feel free to let me know. There's a surprisingly low number of sounds for a track like this. At least I think so. I think the pads are actually like after that, it's really just two bass synthesizers, some drums, and just some creative use of effects and writing some interesting parts. Um, and subverting things like getting rid of the attack here and then revealing it over here. Honestly, with these sorts of sounds, that's kind of what it is. It's more interesting to hear a sound morph and change than to hear a bunch of sounds. And I like a lot of other genres will do. And so, you know, that's what this is. You actually don't need to go down very far. It's kind of funny too. This uses my really old template, and I've moved away from this since. Anyways, if you have any questions about this, drop them down below. Subscribe and hit that bell icon for future videos, and have a blessed day.